Hello, my name is Robert Miller. I'm the research lead for Project Waffles, the Western Aziophlammeus Landscape Study. And this is a re-recording of a brief presentation I gave to the Idaho Chapter of the Wildlife Society meeting last month. It's titled The Dangerous Life of a Short-Eared Owl. Short-eared owl is an open country species in the western United States. It occupies shrublands, grasslands, marshlands, and increasingly cropland type areas. However, we believe the population has suffered a 60 to even 80% decline in the last 40 to 50 years. However, the traditional survey mechanisms are very imprecise for this species, and that's why Project Waffles was started 5 years ago in Idaho, expanding to 2, then 4, and now 8 states. We're in our second year of the full 8-state program. So the threats for short-eared owls occur on 3 scales. There are some immediate direct threats that we have observed as part of our program, some midterm threats with regards to habitat and land cover changes, and then of course climate change on the long term. I'll cover briefly each of these topics. In the short-term threat, we have discovered that roadway mortality is a significant cause of death for short-eared owls, especially young owls shortly after the breeding season. We have documented 123 carcasses along rural roadways. They don't tend to have collisions on the interstate, but on these rural roadways with very little traffic. So we'll be looking at that further. Fence line collisions are another case of mortality. We've documented, I think, at least 3 of these. We suspect that this occurs on much more often and goes undocumented. It's a conservation issue that short-eared owls share with greater sage grouse in the west. Plowing and tilling time. We know that short-eared owls are attracted to stubble and fallow agricultural fields for nesting, and then their nesting occurs right about the time that farmers begin tilling those fields. We know of at least a few nests that have been destroyed by this process. We suspect that the issue is much more widespread. We know that from the literature that short-eared owls are disproportionately impacted by aircraft collisions, making up 20% of the owl species that have been reported. This is volunteer reporting that have been reported in the United States. Some of those deaths have occurred within our study area in Idaho, Nevada, California, etc. Drowning in water tanks. This is a case from southern Idaho. Where we found 4 short-eared owls in tanks without bird ladders. So we're working on this issue with the various conservation agencies. And then lastly, one case that we have not documented specifically, but we know that short-eared owls are susceptible to rodenticide, second-generation rodenticide especially, and we know that second-generation rodenticide is used throughout our study area. However, we've not specifically surveyed for it. We've only tested 2 carcasses, one from Utah and one from Idaho, and both came up negative. But we suspect that this is a broad-scale conservation issue. So those are the short-term issues that our program has identified, or in the case of rodenticide, we believe is occurring. Shifting to the midterm, we're looking at land cover risks. It's been well documented that short-eared owls needs large, intact native landscapes, and that fragmentation of those native landscapes is a key threat. However, it might not all be bad news. The jury's still out on that. We know that short-eared owls are attracted to cropland. Our study has established that. They particularly like these stubble and fallow agricultural fields that may provide complex nesting structures that they're missing in their traditional native landscapes. And then we know that they aren't completely opposed or completely at odds with grazing practices. We have a study partnering with the University of Idaho to look into this much more detail, but we found that light levels of grazing are not incompatible. However, when the grazing across the landscape hits the highest levels, our occupancy rates do drop off. So that's something we can explore further. Looking at the habitat quality versus selection. graph, this is an ecological model where we can evaluate species and evaluate such things as preference versus quality and concepts such as ecological traps. So on the left-hand side, we have high habitat quality moving to low habitat quality on the right-hand side, and then whether the bird is preferring or avoiding those areas. We believe that native habitat used to be in the upper left, but as it continues to degrade due to development, extraction industries, grazing, and fire, it has moved from the upper left over to the right and probably down. That leaves the best habitat being cropland in these grazed landscapes. So it's the highest quality habitat, and we're increasingly seeing the birds, not increasingly, we are finding the birds regularly in these cropland type environments. However, I just mentioned those 6 previous threats to the species. By moving into this area, they're increasingly exposed to roadway mortality and harvest timing and drowning and all of those risks. So as a result, we think that that cropland and grazed landscapes could be an ecological trap. They're attracted there because of the higher prey abundance in cropland, especially in alfalfa fields and some of the other fields of the West. However, that exposes them to increased mortality. And whether that equation comes out positive or negative is something we're still trying to determine. But there's a potential that we're shifting them into an ecological trap. Shifting on to the long-term scale with climate change, we see that this is a predicted distribution of short-eared owls in the West based on our Project Waffles results. And if we extrapolate that out under fairly conservative climate models, we see a very significant reduction in available landscape and range for this species, predicting much further decline. This is conservative because these models assume that we make significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and that there's no further landscape change, which we know to be false. So it's a very conservative model. So one of the common questions that come up with climate change models is, can't the species adapt or adjust to other landscapes? And why we're concerned about this from a short-eared owl perspective is that we know that the short-eared owl range is a complete subset of the northern harrier range, and that means there's landscapes out there that are acceptable to northern harriers but are unacceptable to short-eared owls, and we don't know why that is, but it suggests that this species may be less adaptive to that habitat degradation and variation in habitat quality, and as a result they may be at much higher risk to climate shifts and range shifts pushed by climate change. So more things to look at. So if we want to continue to have views like this on our western landscapes, we're going to have to address both the short terms, the medium term, and the long term issues associated with short-eared owl conservation. Okay, in closing, I just want to say thank you very much to all of the participants of Project Waffles, over 600 and some volunteers in 2018, and hundreds more coming online in 2019. The 5-year program in Idaho has been tremendously successful, and I am in awe by all of the contribution of our volunteers and the excellent work they do. If you have questions, feel free to follow up on our Facebook page, and we hope to see some owls out in the field. Thank you.